So it's 8:30 and lots of people are already here, so it seems you all want to get out and home. Before we can let you go, this is the traditional Banff end of meeting summary. And on behalf of the Banff Foundation, I would like to thank all of you that you came out to this remote place. And because I know it's quite far away from many of you, and I really appreciate what you all have done and contributed to the meeting, which I found it was an exhausting but very stimulating week. And I personally mentioned that to some of you, so why I really enjoy so much being part of this is I feel understood being with all of you in this room, in opposite to talking to my kids or something like that. So no, I think the discussions we had are very, very informative to where our field is going. I took a lot of notes what I have to do over the next 2 years when we reconvene in Paris, hopefully. And we will do it right in the middle of the Olympic Games in Paris and just try to compete. I booked the big stadium for the closing remarks, so we will still try to find a good date that it does not compete with any major events. And then also I heard from a lot of people that they want to come back to this place. So yeah. Okay, good. So it's good, it's convenient for me, okay? But I really, really would like to thank you all what you do for transplant diagnostic, transplantation pathology, and contributing to this process, which, where's Kim?
Here.
There, okay. Which you started 30 years ago next door in this building, 31 years ago, without a plan, without a structure, organically grown to this point where we are today. So I think that's amazing, that's unique to the field of medicine, and you are all instrumental in sustaining that. So without, no, it's you. I'm just trying to pay the bills, and really, you seriously carry the responsibility to develop where transplant diagnostics is going in your area. And the summary here is more or less a debrief and informative to those putting together meeting reports and contributing to meeting reports, which is likely all of you in some form or shape. And in the past, we had a standard approach. So we wrote stuff up, we sent it to a journal, the journal did peer review. Usually the editor then phones you and says, who's got to review this? Everybody's an author, right? Who are we sending this to? So the peer review was kind of limited in providing feedback and input. And then we realized through our surveys and studies Carrie did is what the brainchild was in this room didn't really necessarily resonate with everybody caring for transplant patients across the world. So to try, and thanks to Candice, who was newly appointed with Martin to running the kidney program after Mark said he didn't want to do it anymore after, 15 years. Where Candice said is, how do we engage people who can't afford to travel to the meeting, who do not run like Alex? We did this single cell sequencing in 4,000 patients, and then we integrated with another 22,000 data sets, and then we did some. Not everybody can do that, right? And it shows in one slide something like 10 years of Martin. I have another cohort here of 3,000 to validate this. So how do we engage people actually using the classification, making it credible, and not just what we think is good for our purposes? And we will try new engagement tools for the communities of practice, hope to work with the American Journal of Transplantation as a platform to solicit more feedback. And I hope you all perceive this as positive and not as a nuisance not getting the reports or the projects you have off your desk. So it's, and we're across organs, and again, I hope you can also embark on that process. It is a living, ongoing interaction of refining the classification, of making it better at the benefit of our patients. So that's all of my somewhat opening and closing remarks for today. And we will now get the summaries done in the traditional order of kidney first, and then I forgot the order. I only remember that kidney was first all the time. I don't know. Usually Linda, the VCA, is closing it off, showing another picture of some body part being transplanted, and then you all know where we are. So with that, really, thank you. I can't thank you personally enough to coming out to Banff and supporting the process. Right, with that, and then Candice, please summarize what happened in the kidney field.
Thank you, Michael. So we're going to do this a bit as a double act, so I'll speak a bit and then Martin will speak a bit. We prepared these slides together. And I'm really honoured and happy to be here. I had an absolutely fabulous meeting, and I think it's a real testament to the community that when we put the programme together, we wanted the Banff pre-meeting to be a bit about a reflection about the past and thinking about the future. I was just really impressed on how open and generous with their ideas and transparent everyone here, from new users to established people in the field, were with their feelings and where they thought Banff was not doing well and where they thought it could be improved and what they thought Banff had done well. And so it really fulfilled what I was hoping it would, to allow us to have a really open reflection on strengths and weaknesses of the Banff classification. So one of the points that we debated over this pre-meeting was the mission of Banff, and it was felt quite strongly, I think, by many people in the debates that the classification, we needed to reiterate and make clear that the use of the classification is as a diagnostic tool, both for individual patient management and for clinical trials. And there were some debates about the way it has been used for a prognostic tool, and essentially that's not its primary purpose. It's useful data to help. We need to focus on diagnosis. And I think the next really second important point that came out of our conversations is that the classification needs to translate to patient benefit, and it needs to be usable. And we got feedback from many people about the difficulties they had in using the Banff classification. And there are many ways that we could solve this, and we're not going to solve it now, but two that were put forward were possibly simplifying the classification or using algorithms to help us and support us in applying it. And then a point that some of our more clinical colleagues and immunological colleagues raised is that where possible, the classification needs to be aligned to pathophysiology, and that may not always be possible, but where it is, we should really strive to. And that's important because obviously if we give a diagnosis, it's so the patient gets the treatment, and that needs to be involved in the pathophysiology. So I'm not going to name any names, but these are quotes from senior Banff community members. They'll recognize them. So these are the footnotes, and someone referred to them as a visual assault. And another senior Banff leader said, it's impossible not to make errors. But we didn't only get feedback from senior members of the community. This is a slide from Turkey of a survey of Turkish nephropathologists, and you can see in the graph on the right that 50% only partially understands the Banff classification. So the Pittsburgh group and the Paris Transplant group have developed algorithms in which you can enter the Banff lesion scores, and they can give you a diagnosis according to the complex Banff rules. And these are developed and intended to be used as companions for diagnosis, so that the pathologist can use them alongside their normal workload. And I think these are very promising for helping us in our work. Oops, this isn't supposed to happen. Sorry. There we go. So algorithms are certainly a fabulous tool that we could be integrating. Another possibility is also to think about simplification. And several of you made the point that the classification needs to be universally applicable, not only by those who have access to molecules and algorithms and DSA at the time of diagnosis. And so a discussion was had about how you could have a classification that's hierarchical, in the sense that you can, and I've given an example here with microvascular inflammation, but in the sense that you can make a morphological diagnosis, and then where you can, and as the information becomes available to you, you can add in layers, such as once you know there's a DSA, you can then make a pathophysiological diagnosis of antibody-mediated rejection. Similarly, we can think of ways in the future where molecules or digital pathology could be incorporated by those who can, but you still have a backbone morphological diagnosis that to work for if you don't. And this is a slide from colleagues in Uruguay, particularly around the subject of antibody-mediated rejection, is that being one of the main difficulties that people report with the classification. And their preference is for the term microvascular inflammation with or without DSA to help guide clinicians in therapy. So the second big conversation was around consensus and changes to the classification. And Alex Lupi shared with us some feedback that he'd received from users about how the Banff classification is changing too often. And this charts the changes in the Banff classification since its inception. The X's marking changes, the lighter ones are minor changes. And you can see how recently there have been many changes, and this has led to complaints. So in light of this, it's worth rethinking the consensus process. Banff typically, in its earliest manuscripts, described the evidence level that was needed to introduce changes as at least two independent groups providing evidence. But we don't really have a guideline for, once you have that evidence, how you then reach a consensus. And we had some conversations about alternative models for reaching consensus, such as that used in KDIGO or the Delphi method. And these are things that, as a community, I think we should consider moving forward, whether they are tools that we want to adapt. And then I've seen this graph about 100 times this week, and I think it illustrates really nicely one change that we could easily introduce when we want to implement change in the Banff classification, which is to stress test it before we implement it, so that we can model the changes that it will have on our practice and reflect on that change. And if it is indeed introducing a change that is clinically useful and meaningful, then adapt in the classification after. And this sort of stress test should obviously be done not just in one center, but in multiple centers, so that a consensus can be reached. And then we had conversations about innovation and the future of Banff. And Banff classification has always been forward-looking and encouraging innovation. And I was really pleased to see the multidisciplinary attendance at this meeting, and in particular the presence of a growing number of computer and data scientists who are clearly going to become our companions in clinical diagnosis in the future. They're already there, and they're just going to expand and become more of our community. So we all welcome them, and we hope to learn from them as they learn from us as well, to develop good tools for patient care. So we heard a bit about also the conflict between driving this innovation and also regulation and implementation. And Alex Lupi shared with us his iBox roadmap, which is extremely impressive. And he also shared with us the pains in getting from the concept to very near, if not at, regulatory approval. And this is a real inspiration to us, and a real education, I think, to everyone in the room, so that we know we've got now in front of us the pathway that our new tools are going to have to take, really, to be incorporated in clinical care. And then just to finish this, I want sort of a reflection on how Banff can encourage innovation. Are we doing a good enough job at both encouraging innovation and ensuring a robust clinical diagnostic classification for patient care that's preserved, but also updated? And Michael normally at this stage shows a complex graph that I've never really understood about the Banff process. So I've done a really simplified version of it. But what I want to highlight here is the role of the Banff working group. So normally these Banff working groups collate evidence and then feedback at the meeting, and that can inform the Banff classification report. And you also have a loop on the side which is basically going back to the community. So much of the research actually happens in the community and also gets fed back at the meeting, and we review evidence. But maybe we're missing a bit of a trick in engaging with that research community with the working groups so that we can drive things forward. And we heard this week that some Banff working groups are very hardworking and even meet every other week, which is fantastic, but others are less hardworking. So it's, and the digital pathology working group has made a really good job at engaging with the wider research community and trying to link it back into Banff. So I think that's a model for everyone to think about how we might do that. And then moving on to molecular microscope, this was the afternoon. So I think everyone here agrees that molecular tests are likely to become companion tools for diagnosis very soon, and several groups presented equivocal cases that were solved with molecular diagnosis. And I don't want to go into detail, but I just want to project some examples. So we had a case from Vienna, a case with just PTC1, where the molecular microscope was able to confirm no rejection. We had a case from Manitoba of a patient with microcirculation inflammation early post-transplantation, possibly related to delayed graft function with C4D and PTC3, where the University of Alberta was able to confirm the absence of a molecular AMR signature. And also an example from the Paris transplant group of a patient with microcirculation inflammation and an anti-AT1R antibody, where they found a very strong AMR signature. So clearly we are getting closer and closer, and we've got we're moving towards a situation where we have defined classifiers with thresholds that are being tested for their added value to diagnosis. And this applies not just to antibody, but also to T-cell mediated rejection. And the Banff Molecular Working Group, I think, has a really important role here in helping to define the context of use for these tests. And is there any way that we can support regulatory approval by doing some work within the Banff community is something I think we need to be thinking about. And then I'm just flagging up again that we also need to be considering as we go along that some people won't have access to molecular diagnosis, so we also need to be preserving a sort of baseline morphological diagnosis behind that. So a few words about the chronic active TCMR working group that met on Tuesday. I think the summary of this session is that there was universal agreement that IFTA is a feature of poor prognosis. We saw some data that the threshold for IFTA may be too high, and that IFTA1 and TI1 might have also a prognostic role. And then we reviewed the evidence for IFTA as a feature of chronic TCMR, and I personally think this evidence remains conflicting. We had some groups that sort of rediscussed the data that led to its inclusion in the category of chronic TCMR, and then we had other groups presenting evidence that some of these cases have a molecular profile that's more in keeping with antibody-mediated rejection or an inactive inflammatory infiltrate, and still more groups showing that there are limited responses to anti-TCMR therapies. So the outcome of this session is, I think, to outline the unresolved issues and the questions that we need to answer. Does IFTA belong in the TCMR category? Can we stress test it? Or could it be an independent score outside of a diagnostic group that could be used for variable causes such as AMR as well? We need to know how and if to treat it, and we still have the issue of borderline and how we might progress in having a firmer diagnosis there, whether it's with CCTT criteria or molecular help. So the TCMR working group is ideally placed to consider these questions and think about solutions to them. And Poverty did call for co-chairs to join him, in particular clinicians, but also pathologists, and there was talk of having even more than one co-chair, having a wider leadership group to really reinvigorate and push this field forward. And then very briefly, we had to review the definitions of tubulitis because they were contradictory over the last decade or so. And after discussion, it was sort of agreed that probably keeping things as they were for now is the best solution. So this is results of the work of the Banff Rules of Dissemination Working Group, and now we'll be able to go live with the website with this definition on it. I'm going to hand over to Martin.
I've had people all run away from me to kids, now it's going to be worse.
So Candice, you should just have continued. You are doing perfectly, I think. You said indeed that Banff classification is not only used for clinical implementation and use, but also for clinical trials. Actually, that's how the Banff classification was started in the beginning of the 90s, to also be used as endpoint in clinical trials. Not only as endpoint, but also for inclusion. So we diagnose rejection and we can then start testing treatments for the rejection. So the Banff classification is of extreme importance also for industry, and this is one aspect that we should not forget. And we have seen at a session that was specifically targeting the clinical trials that there was a huge heterogeneity in the definitions, that the different major trials in the world testing new drugs for registration, that they used different definitions and different issues of the Banff classification. And this is really a problem that we want to address. And we have been brainstorming on, should we then have a clinical Banff classification next to a clinical trial Banff classification? And the consensus was that we should only have one Banff classification that actually allows to align them perfectly. And so we have, I think, the mission to make Banff great again. It is already great, but we should improve it certainly to make sure that the clinical trial people are using the classification that we use for clinics. And we had a whole afternoon, I'm summarizing it in only 7 key messages on how we could actually align the Banff classification better to be used also for clinical trials. And it would be by simplifying the classification, first of all, as already Candice suggested, also for the clinical use, by reducing and trying to reduce the footnotes, and also, for instance, to have better and clearer definitions of phenotypes that we see, for instance, VSA positive versus VSA negative MVI, which is a cause of a lot of discussions both in clinics and in clinical trials. The second is that we are implementing within the Banff classification some innovations. And this is, of course, to steer research and to make sure that the field is going into the right direction in the future, but we might want to distinguish a bit those aspects that are fully validated and corroborated, and what is not yet fully validated not to be used in clinical trials. So really to make sure that this is clear to everyone. On another note, we will not be able to simplify the Banff classification to extremely simplistic system, because it is inherently complex. And so we have seen, both from Paris and from Pittsburgh, systems that allow you to translate lesion scores into automated final diagnosis, and this would lead to a better and more robust endpoint, for instance, as clinical trials. And we have also discussed whether, for instance, these systems, which are a bit complementary, could even be considered to be integrated. The fourth aspect that was discussed is that the Banff lesion scoring and the final diagnosis are not always reproducible, and this impacts on the power calculations, for instance, for clinical trials. And we have seen suggestions that morphometry could be useful. Of course, these morphometric measures need to be validated, they need to be also accepted by the health authorities, so we are not yet there, but we have listened to solutions there. Another piece of extreme importance is that the central pathology is, of course, crucial in clinical trials, but we have seen that if you add clinical information to the information that a pathologist has, that this leads to better final diagnosis, even in the context of clinical trials. So not only in clinical practice, pathologists need to have clinical information, but also in clinical trial environment. So we have also clear consensus that we need to move away from biopsy-proven acute rejection as an endpoint, but that we have to distinguish TCMR and ABR, which have clearly different phenotypes, different timings, different impact on outcome, and that there is a clear consensus on that aspect. And finally, I think we can use the example that Peter Nickerson is setting with the TCMR working group that is specifically working on the definition of TCMR, but also TCMR trials to see what are the endpoints for these trials. And for that, he is not working on his own. He is working in extreme collaboration between all the major transplant societies, and also has delegation, official delegation from the Banff Foundation. So he sets the stage of how the pathologists involved here, the clinicians, the immunologists involved here, should be discussing the clinical trial design up front. We have been talking a lot about surrogate endpoints, and surrogate endpoints for late graft failure, of course, should include the multidimensional aspects of graft failure, and it's already shown by Candice, but we have to celebrate the success of the iBox, which really illustrates that if you have a persistent long-term effort, that this leads to a positive end result in the long term, but you have to be persistent and to attract many people to this field. And I think that Mark Segal and the people who actually started the Transplant Therapeutic Consortium have been an example of how the attraction of the transplant societies, but also the inclusion of companies, for instance, is the way forward. And this is an example that I don't use that I would use beyond the surrogate endpoints discussions. This is an example that we should have for many things that we do in our field. The second topic I would like to briefly discuss is the AMR and MVI conundrum. And Lynn Cornell has made this slide, and we had a lot of discussion on the DSA positive AMR, how we should incorporate the spectrum of DSA positive AMR, so HLA DSA positive AMR, in our classification. And we are a bit worried about, I would say, the exceptions. But in some centers, desensitizing, for instance, of using cross-match positive transplants, these are not the exceptions. So if we change the classification, we should make sure that we do not lose too many of these exceptions. They are not exceptions anymore then. We have also discussed the spectrum of HLA DSA positive AMR, and the main problem is that we are, say, putting these patients or these phenotypes into bins, while actually it's a spectrum of disease that is also fluctuating over time. And Mark Haas has proposed last time, and again this time, a way to try to have the more granular and also quantitative evaluation of activity and chronicity. Mark, I would like to pay tribute to all the work that you have been doing over the past 15 years for the classification. You have been working in the past, but it's clear that you are still continuing to think with us on the future, so this is, I think, something we need to continue. We have the bright human intelligence of Mark Haas, but we also have artificial intelligence, and so we have tried to look whether we can also calculate this kind of activity and chronicity scores with mathematics. It seems to work. It is likely of importance beyond what Mark suggested, chronic active ABMR, but could also be valid for other diseases, for instance also TCMR, so there's aspect of activity and chronicity in each of the phenotypes that we have. And we are considering to start a working group. Instead of implementing this kind of ideas quickly and without simulations, I think we need a working group that really addresses whether and how we can implement this kind of approaches in our system. We also had a lot of discussion on the DSA negative microvascular inflammation conundrum, where we have in Banff 2017 eliminated, apparently, we see in hindsight, apparently a large group of patients. We have listened to people discussing that this could be related to the lack of testing depth, and the HLA people have a lot of tools, they have guidelines, but very often we as clinicians, pathologists, we don't go back to the HLA people to ask, can you look deeper? Because they can look deeper to detect the HLA DSA. So if we say HLA DSA negative, we should be sure that it is indeed negative. There's also a lot of interest in non-HLA antibodies, where the STAR review that is coming out will be instrumental. We need tools in our clinical practice. This is at the moment lacking. We also heard about the NK cell activation that can also be not antibody driven. Missing self has been named often, but there's many other mechanisms that NK cell that can activate NK cells. And the main message is here that we need validation before this can be considered for clinical practice. And finally, we also listened to the studies that indicate that even ischemia reperfusion injuries, so not immune driven, can lead to exactly the same phenotype. So this is heterogeneous cause of the same phenotype. And so when we were at the meeting on Wednesday afternoon, we think that the consensus was that we should start, as Canis suggested, to have a histological description of what we see. And if you at that time to have the HLA antibody status and that is positive, yeah, you can of course, and you should go deeper and you call this HLA-DSA positive AMR. If you do not have the HLA-DSA at that time, not the testing, you don't know, you should of course go for the testing and if it is positive, you again call it HLA-DSA positive AMR. But if you do not find HLA-DSA, we should be a bit more cautious and we should call it more descriptive as HLA-DSA negative microvascular inflammation, of which the cause is potentially unclear. It can be including antibodies and caused by antibodies, but we don't know. We also had a discussion on the place of C4D in this, and we have a lot of consensus to keep it as it is currently in Banff classification as a substitute of DSA, not necessarily HLA-DSA, but the complement deposition on the peripheral capillaries is apparently very suggestive of the antibodies, despite the fact that it might also be seen sometimes in early ischemia reperfusion injury cases. So finally, we also discussed the definition of microvascular inflammation. There's different options. We discussed them in quite depth. It's too early, I think, to settle this down, because we want, again, as Candice said, to simulate what is the effect of each of the different definitions on the exceptions and to not lose patients in our classification system. Finally, beyond what we can do now and how we define now microvascular inflammation, we are having a working group that is also looking at the definition of peripheral capillarities, which is currently related to the number of cells in the most affected PTC, but there is nice single-center data that show that the extent is also important. And so the PTC working group is working on how in multicenter studies the PTC extent, but also dilatation of the PTC could be important to further improve the classification of microvascular inflammation. And so also this is working group in progress. I think I stop here and give the word to Candice. I hope you're not going too much over time.
So I'm not going to say too much on this. I want to sort of show Brad Ferris's slide on the digital pathology working group, just to highlight the work that they've been doing in collecting image banks and platforms to share the images and the algorithms, but also linking in with a number of groups that you can see listed there in blue. So that's the point really of the working groups, I think, is to try to engage with the rest of the research community to drive things forward within the Banff classification. One last point is xenotransplantation. We had really interesting talks about preclinical models of pig to primate transplantation and early observations in pig to human decedent transplantation, showing very similar findings in both of thrombotic microangiopathy moving on to CG lesions. And here we have the opportunity to incorporate molecular diagnosis potentially right from the beginning in the development of a classification for xenotransplantation, with the Paris group working on the BPOT, first cross-species gene expression panel. And so this is a slide from Ivy Rosales showing a first proposal for a VAC scoring for xenografts in the kidney. So I'll finish just by re-emphasizing the working groups and how many of them have presented here. Some of them have met, others have sent in reports. There may be some new ones that are reinvigorated, the implantation, the xenotransplantation, activity and chronicity indices, and just to make a call to those of you who are willing to put in some hard work to join the working groups by contacting the leaders who are in the Banff manuscripts. So thank you very much for your hard work this week, and this was us last night, and that was you, so hope you had a good time. And thank you for your attention.